Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Global Forest Summit, today co-hosted in Brussels by Reforest'Action and the Open Diplomacy Institute. It is the second edition of the civil society-led conference that is the global yearly landmark event for forest. We are very happy with Stéphane Hallaire, my co-chair, and CEO of Reforest'Action, to welcome you from all over the world. We have attendances from France to Gabon, from South Africa to India, from Indonesia to Brazil, from Japan to the US. We are very, very happy to bring everyone today under one same roof. We are based in Brussels. It's a digital event. You will be able to engage with many different stakeholders, game-changing actors for forest the whole day. And I'm happy to give the floor right now to Stéphane Hallaire, who we've been building with this Global Forest Summit since last year.
Thank you, Thomas. Reforest'Action and myself are very happy, honored to co-organize with yourself and the Open Diplomacy Institute this second edition of the Global Forest Summit. Last year it was in Paris and online. We had 3,300 people from 154 countries who attended this summit. Thank you very much for being with us again today for this second edition in Brussels and online. The world has set up a number of objectives for forest protection, restoration, and management. But what's the point of setting objectives if we don't monitor changes, if we don't monitor successes or lack of successes? So to monitor the progress we make against these objectives, we have decided to make the Global Forest Summit the global landmark conference for forest to monitor the progress we make. Now, there are, you will throughout the day hear a number of experts and panelists that have been selected by our advisory board. And I take this moment, this opportunity to send a big thank you to the members of our advisory board who have made this event possible. This is a multi-stakeholder event. Thank you very much. Now, among the number of objectives that the world has defined during the last few decades, we've selected few of them. We've selected the UN Global Forest Goals, the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests, and the Bonn Challenge. During this day, we will focus on three main topics. The first one is, how do we protect faster? There is still 10 million hectares disappearing every single year today. This is sky high, and we need to reduce that to zero as soon as possible. Secondly, we need to restore stronger forest, 350 million hectares to restore by 2030. And we need to manage better. All forests in the world should be sustainably managed, and it's not the case. Why? But for us to achieve these three main objectives, we need funds. The forest need funds. This year, in 2022, $2.4 billion will be allocated to forests. This is big money, but yet not enough. By 2030, we need to reach somewhere between $400 and $600 billion in a decade. So as you can tell, the challenges are huge, but so is our commitment and our capability to act big and act now. Throughout the day, you will have the opportunity to listen to experts from institutions, NGOs, and companies. But not only. You see, I'm just back from Ecuador when I had the opportunity to meet indigenous people. They are known to be the best forest keepers in the world. They know how to live in the forest, with the forest, without destroying it, even by improving biodiversity in forest. How do they do? I'm honored to announce that at the closing panel today, we will welcome Gregorio Mirabel, who is the chair of COICA, the entity that represents all indigenous people in the Amazon forest. But also throughout the day, we will welcome a number of personalities that live in, for the forest on a daily basis. How do they act? How do they react to what happens to the global forests? Once again, our objective is to share experience, best practices on how to make sure that forests continue to deliver and increase their capability to deliver ecosystemic services to all of us, but also to offer their beauty to the world. So in line with the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, we need to deliver. We need to succeed. So thank you and welcome to the second edition of the Global Forest Summit that I am honored with Reforest'Action to co-organize with you, Thomas, and Open Diplomacy Institute.
Thank you so much, Stéphane. We are indeed based in Brussels. You just came back from the Amazon yourself. Brussels is today a bit special as a city because there is a European Council and a NATO summit that takes place in the midst of a crisis, of a military crisis, that question all of us in the way we can achieve the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals and all the different frameworks, reference frameworks that you've mentioned, the Bonn Challenge, the UN Global Forest Goals, as well as the objectives of the New York Declaration on Forest. Those all come to 2030, and here today in Brussels, we're still questioning in the midst of this military crisis this 2030 objectives and trying to make sure that we reach the line of the 2030 objectives. We will talk it all through the day. From New York to Glasgow, it's the question that we will discuss in the first session and see how precisely we can make sure that money is flowing into the right direction and makes us as powerful as possible to reach those objectives that we will keep looking at by 2030 as the yearly Global Landmark Conference for Forest. In the second session, we will, of course, talk about Stockholm Plus 50 and all economic questions that surround forest issues and all type of economic challenges that have been posed to forest, their sustainable management, the way it can help in fighting deforestation and enhancing restoration. And Stockholm is a very, very symbolic city this year as it marks the 50th anniversary of the 1972 UN conference, the first UN conference on the environment. And then we will move to Rio Plus 30. Of course, it's also the good year to wonder on the sustainable best practices that we can have to make sure forests are indeed sustainably managed. So we are based in Brussels. You are stemming from more than 130 countries as we are connected now. But we will go into New York, Stockholm, Rio, and probably another capital will be announced at the closing panel where His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, will talk about the 2023 summit. But as we speak about those cities and this timeline, 2030, this is also the timeline of the UN Decade for Ecosystems Restoration. We've been so keen on speaking last year when it was launched aside the Global Forest Summit. And this is why I'm very happy to host Dr. Susan Garner, Director of UNEP's Ecosystems Division, who will give an official address to our audience today. Thank you very much, Susan, for being with us. I'm giving the floor to you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be able to share some opening reflections with you here today. And let me start by thanking Stephanie and Thomas and the Open Diplomacy Institute and Reforest'Action for inviting me to provide remarks at this important event. Now, I'm speaking to you now from Kenya, where, as like so many countries across the world, forests are truly life. Bordering here, the UNEP offices where I am today, is the beautiful Kura Forest. That's an example of the power of our relationship with nature. From its history as a colonial woodlot that once fed the Uganda Railway to its current story of hope. It's a story of restoration and protection. And it's because of sound environmental governance and then environmental heroes like the late Wangari Maathai, who was the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and the leader of the Green Belt movement. And because of so many that followed her footsteps, Karura has been protected and transformed back into a rejuvenating upland forest, and right here in the heart of the bustling capital of Nairobi. It's providing safe habitat for over 600 species of wildlife. It's providing ecosystem-based livelihoods. It's providing clean air and clean water, and a whole plethora of ecosystem services for all Kenyans every day. Karura Forest is now over a 1,000-hectare symbol of healing and hope, synonymous with the journey that all of us are on. Now, UNEP, and in fact, the broader environmental movement has journeyed far since our birth 50 years ago at the 1972 Stockholm Conference. This journey has carried the environment from something that was just on the fringes to the mainstream. And there's never before been such heightened global awareness of the urgency of our situation, of the understanding that the triple planetary crisis impacts our livelihoods. It impacts our physical and our mental health and our sense of self. In fact, all life on Earth as we know it. The IPCC recently told us, just last month, that global warming has caused dangerous disruption to the natural world and is resulting in climate injustice. Nature and biodiversity loss are undermining the SDGs. A recent report from UNEP and Grid Arundel found that without urgent action, climate change and land use change will drive wildfires up 30% just by 2050. And every year, forests absorb about a third of the carbon dioxide released from burning fossil fuels worldwide. When the UN Deputy Secretary General was here in Nairobi just a couple weeks ago attending the UN Environment Assembly, she reminded us that drastically reducing deforestation and systemically restoring forests and other ecosystems is the single largest nature-based opportunity for climate mitigation. And yet, we know that if current deforestation was a country, it would rank third in carbon dioxide emissions. It would account for approximately 11% of carbon emissions, more than the entire global transportation sector. And the current rate of ecosystem loss is bringing humanity closer to extremely dangerous tipping points. Recent studies from the Amazon rainforest have demonstrated their global importance for our environment, for ourselves, for the climate, not just locally, not regionally, globally. We know there's no Paris and there's no SDGs without forest, and we must protect standing forest ecosystems and ensure their sustainable use. We have just about 8 years to close the gap in emissions reductions. 8 years in which we must increase ambition, implement pledges, act on our plans, and commit and ultimately deliver the cuts. We saw great traction at COP26 with the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forest and Land Use. UNEP supports the message of the declaration for unprecedented attention and momentum. And at the same time, being mindful that much of this was already envisioned within SDG Target 15.2. In 2022, we now need to translate this credible action and transformative change. And let's do this. Let's replicate for deforestation the conditions that are enabling decarbonization in other sectors in the world economy, So for example, with renewables, demonstrating the combined effect of carbon prices and predictable financing, which forest countries desperately need to implement national policies. For deforestation, this translates into results-based payments that change the economies of forest conservation and restoration are really requiring. If this is to be successful, we also need to see significantly more political will to rechannel harmful subsidies from environmental degradation into climate action and the conservation and restoration of nature. These are complex issues, but we do know what to do, and we have the strong foundation to build on. The main step is to accelerate implementation. Partnerships like the UN REDD, the UN Interagency Flagship Program on Forests and Climate, are tried and tested, vehicles supporting countries and stakeholders to unlock forest's true potential. The UN REDD has mobilized more than $1 billion since its inception and supported countries in achieving emission reductions equal to taking 150 million cars off the road. And the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is a rallying cry to heal our planet. It estimates the finance needed to restore 350 million hectares of degraded landscape, which, remember, was the target of the New York Declaration on Forests, is about $1 trillion by 2030. Altogether, governments by now committed to restore 1 billion hectares of degraded land by 2030, including the G20 declaration, the Leaders' Declaration. This will require much more commitment, much more finance, and more political will. But we can get the job done. Only, though, if we get moving now, and only if we take advantage of every opportunity. We must be nimble and quick-footed. We know that restoration works. We know that every dollar invested in restoration creates up to $30 in economic benefits. And while being a climate change adaptation solution, it's much cheaper than any of the technology-based solutions. We've already seen real restoration successes, big and small. Costa Rica implemented policies in the 1980s that led to doubling forest cover and tripling their national income. The Great Green Wall has already seen almost 18 million hectares of degraded land restored and 350,000 jobs created. The UN Decade's Multi-Partner Trust Fund has started supporting initiatives. But to reach the 1 billion hectares restored and to attain SDGs, I have to say this again, we really need to hit the ground running. We must link forest deforestation agenda to action on climate, biodiversity, resource use and economy through the appropriate intergovernmental scientific bodies. And let's repurpose subsidies that contribute to the degradation of nature and demonstrate that financing deforestation-free value chains is economically viable. Let's scale up models that have proven to work because investments in nature-based solutions need to be at least tripled by 2030. Let's adopt an inclusive wealth as a more accurate measure of economic progress, but something that will rest on introducing in a widespread form natural capital accounting. And let's see land for conserving nature set aside, remembering that we don't need to fix everything with human interventions. In many cases, if we leave nature alone, it will recover. Let's also remember that restoration is not a substitute for protecting forests or decarbonization of our economies. That's critically important. Climate and biodiversity benefits of restoration may take 100 years to bear fruit. On the other hand, the climate and biodiversity impacts of losing forests are felt immediately. Both conservation and restoration should be done together. addressing the root causes of degradation. This means addressing unsustainable consumption and production patterns, reforming economic and financial systems, encouraging individuals to adjust their life cycles, their lifestyles, where possible. Now it's our turn. It's our time to turn this ambition into action, becoming the generation that conserves, the generation that restores and heals our ecosystems is the defining task of our time on this planet. And I'd like to think that we were all born for this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. You just spoke about this generation restoration that UNEP is so keen on advocating for. I do echo what Stéphane said last year in his opening remarks of the Global Forest Summit, having a generation of restoration and reforestation entrepreneurs that echoes a lot to what the Global Forest Summit is meant to achieve. It's not a summit where you take new pledges and drop new figures. We remain stick to the fact, driven by knowledge, driven by science, to make sure that implementation on the ground happens on time by 2030. This line is very meaningful to restore faster, to protect faster. This is the first point you've made. It's clearly the main priority, but also now to restore stronger because the climate crisis has already had impacts on the ground, on ecosystems, and to manage better. Those are the key ideas we will revolve around today in spinning around these economic questions that you've clearly outlined in this introductory speech from UNEP's side. We need to find money, finance these efforts of protection, restoration, and sustainable management. That's going to be the topic of the first session we have today. We also need to shift our models to change the way we operate our economies. That's going to be the topic of the second session we have early on this afternoon, CET. And last but not least, we need to improve the way we implement restoration on the ground. That's going to be the third discussion and session this afternoon to Paris time. This all brings us to a paradigm shift, getting to a more circular bioeconomy. This is going to be the topic of the last conversation we will have in closing this event. We will therefore welcome FAO representative. I'm mentioning here FAO because FAO is co-leading the UN Decade for Ecosystems Restoration, close to UNEP, who is at the forefront of this issue. We are very happy, Suzanne, that you took the floor today. You did mention we know what to do, and that is probably a good way to say what the Global Summit is about, taking action, making sure it's viable on the ground and giving results. And that's what our next guest will remind us, because we know what to do for years now. And for years, Dr. Jane Goodall, Dam Commander of the British Empire, founder of the Jane Goodall Institute, and also UN Messenger for Peace, which is not a point I like to miss here because we need to link environmental crisis with peace issue today, is our next guest. And I'm very, very honored to give the floor to Jane Goodall now.
Hello, this is Jane Goodall. I'm so pleased that I've been invited to say a few words during the 2022 Global Forest Summit. Sadly, we must acknowledge the fact that in spite of so many efforts to protect our forests, we're still losing them around the world or depleting them at a terrifying rate. The reasons you all know: irresponsible commercial logging, poverty-driven deforestation as people desperately try to make a living, cattle ranching and clearing forest for new grazing or growing of grain for factory farms and for biofuel and other forms of industrial agriculture, clearing them for living space for growing human populations, and finally the terrifying forest fires that seem to be getting worse in recent years, at least partly due to climate change. Forests have even burned in the Arctic Circle. You also all know about the services that are provided by forests, including absorbing CO2, providing oxygen, regulating the climate and rainfall, and providing timber, medicinal plants, and a variety of foods. Moreover, many of the rainforests are home to a staggeringly rich diversity of animal and plant species, and the loss of biodiversity along with climate change are threatening the future of life on Earth as we know it. I learned a good deal about a forest ecosystem and the effect of deforestation during my years studying chimpanzees in the Tanzanian woodlands and forests of Gombe National Park and the surrounding area. When I began the research in 1960, the small park was part of the great equatorial forest belt that stretched across to the west coast. But 25 years later, that forest was vanishing at a terrifying rate, and the forest left was becoming increasingly fragmented. When I flew over Gombe and the surrounding area in 1987, I was absolutely shocked to see just a very small island of forest, and it was surrounded by bare hills. The Gombe chimpanzees were isolated and threatened by inbreeding. The trees had been cut down by villagers desperate to survive by making money from charcoal or timber or to get new land for farming because their own farmland was overused and increasingly infertile, and their families were growing, and they were too poor to buy food from elsewhere. They were trying to grow crops by cutting down trees on increasingly steep slopes, causing terrible erosion and sometimes devastating mudslides. In the rainy season, that is. That's when it hit me that if we didn't help these people find ways of making a living without destroying their environment, there was no way we could protect chimpanzees, forests, or anything else. The Jane Goodall Institute initiated our holistic method of community-based, community-led conservation, Takari. We started it in 1994. It included restoring fertility to overused land without agricultural chemicals, I hasten to add, better health and education facilities in the villages, water management programs, microcredit opportunities that enabled villagers to start their own environmentally sustainable businesses, scholarships for girls, give them a chance of secondary education, and family planning information, eagerly received because so many villagers realized the way out of poverty was a good education for their children. Most recently, GIS, GPS, and satellite imagery were introduced, and volunteers from the different villages attended workshops to learn how to monitor the health of their village forest reserves using smartphones or iPads. And the data was uploaded onto a platform in the clouds, Global Forest Watch. This technology enabled village leaders to make land use management plans, and as they came to trust us, they set aside land around the national park as a buffer zone to minimize conflict between people and animals. It was available for sustainable activities such as gathering mushrooms and medicinal plants, and for beekeeping. We began with the 12 villages around Gombe, but the program now operates in 104 villages throughout the chimp range in Tanzania. And villagers are setting aside land for forest corridors, allowing safe passage of chimpanzees and other animals between the remaining scattered chimpanzee communities. It took time, but Takari has been very successful. People realize that protecting the forest is not only good for wildlife, but for their own future. They've become our partners in conservation. Satellite imagery shows that the slopes that were bare at the start of our program are now once more covered in trees. The forests, along with their biodiversity, are returning. The Takari approach is operating in 6 other African countries, including the very important Albertine Rift in Uganda. Of course, we're working with chimpanzees, so all these Takari-type programs are around chimpanzee habitat where we're working. We cooperate with local government agencies and other NGOs to develop small-scale forest tourism, and this brings in much-needed foreign exchange, which makes the central government happy. It also provides jobs for local communities. In other words, it gives people a financial incentive to protect their forests. In all the village schools, in all the villages where we work, we have introduced conservation education through our Roots and Shoots program for children of all ages. This engages them in projects such as tree planting and learning about the animals and plants that make up their own unique ecosystem. As much as possible, we encourage children to choose their own projects, and once they understand the problems and are empowered to act, they are unbelievably enthusiastic, dedicated, and hard-working. Roots and Shoots operates in 65 countries, including many where there is an emphasis on planting trees and restoring and protecting forests, and restoring and protecting mangroves as well. I've been talking about grassroots programs that involve local communities protecting their forests and other environments for their own future. These programs, if they're successful, are sustainable. But there are other programs in which trees are assigned monetary value by the government. One highly successful example comes from Costa Rica. In 1979, when it was estimated the country had lost up to 50% of its forests, the government launched the Payment for Environment scheme, whereby money was paid to owners of forests and forest plantations in recognition of the vital role they played in maintaining clean air and pure water for the country, for the whole country. As a result, Costa Rica became the first tropical country to have stopped and subsequently reversed deforestation. Also, in one fascinating project, Daniel Jansen and a group of Costa Rican colleagues, including Oscar Arias, who was president at the time, they were able to demonstrate that denuded tropical forest can be restored. And this was a landmark achievement in ecological restoration. Another thing I want to mention is that more conservationists are recognizing the importance of listening to the indigenous people of the forest and understanding their role as traditional guardians of their land. These people are teaching us much, but they need all the support we can give them, for tragically they've been persecuted, threatened, killed, forcibly removed from their tribal lands by the commercial interests of those wanting to exploit the forest for short-term gain, either by leasing out the land for mining and oil exploration or for clear-cutting to make use of the rich forest soil. And that's for farming. This is particularly shocking because after a few years, this forest soil is exhausted, and once again, toxic agricultural chemicals come into play, gradually killing the very soil on which we all depend. I want to end by saying how strongly I feel that we shouldn't only think of forests in terms of their services. Forests were not created solely for the benefit of humans. We should protect them for their own sake. There's more and more information coming out about the underground communication between the trees of a forest, information that is as fascinating as it is important. And we're now beginning to learn more about the fascinating life up in the canopy. Some creatures never come down to the ground. I've always loved trees. I've had the privilege of walking through a forest in Central Africa that has never been logged, standing with my hand on the trunk of a tree that has lived there for a couple of 1,000 years, its crown lost in the canopy high above. When I'm alone in a forest, I feel such a strong spiritual connection with a world that teems with life, with the sounds of birds and insects, the flashes of colour as a butterfly flits through a shaft of sunlight that penetrates the canopy. The leaves rustle in a gentle breeze that creates moving light patterns on the forest floor. Monkeys or squirrels move through the branches overhead. The sounds of elephant or bush pigs moving through the undergrowth. We must preserve this rich tapestry of life. The forest is not ours to destroy, but to protect for all future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goodall, dear Jen, for this very, very wise words that we needed to hear as the keynote, the first keynote speech of today's 2022 Global Forest Summit. You've clearly outlined two main ideas I'd like to take away before we move to our first session. First is that we need to take into account the nexus there is between sustainability issues and specifically forests, as we discussed this today, and peace for communities, but also among nations. And that's going to be one of the other lessons that we need to draw from the IPCC assessment report that recently was published, that Susan mentioned earlier on. You are the UN Peace Messenger, and as the Jane Goodall Institute founder, you've also given us another message that I'd like to highlight in wrapping up this session, is the importance to lead by example, just like you did yourself your whole life long. This is what is at stake in delivering this Global Forest Summit. We don't take any new pledges. We want to make sure we move forward in achieving things. You've outlined Costa Rica as being probably the most powerful example of ecosystems restoration when it comes down to forest, that we need to highlight as a message of hope to all that hear us from across the globe, from Chad to the UK, from Kenya to Netherlands, from Gabon to Indonesia, from Benin to India. That's very important. And leading by example is not only for decision makers, it's for everyone. You've mentioned the very important role of communities on the ground that we will not only hear as you kindly invited us to do, but also to which we give the floor, and we want to hear their voice, and we have been struggling and making sure that they are heard in such international forums today. Their role as communities on the ground is also to warn us, to make sure, Stéphane has given us example this morning on sharing knowledge on the best ideas to make sure we achieve the objectives that we referred to from the UN frameworks. And the last example that you gave from this is the way that communities, and it does not mean only indigenous communities, but all communities, even in northern countries, can make sure that we keep monitoring deforestation with the Global Forest Watch. That is one of the tools you've mentioned. It's very important that everyone knows the Global Forest Storage that has been set up by the WRI, the World Resource Institute. We will specifically talk about those data when we meet with John Curry later on this afternoon, as this is one of the most powerful science indicator we have to keep looking at how we manage things on the ground from a year to another by 2030, as we are action-driven and we need to stick to those objectives and making sure of the implementation. Those data are very, very important to us. So thank you for outlining those key ideas that we will keep deepening during the day. It's now time for me to wrap up this opening panel, just reminding you that it's an interactive event. When you can ask your question to our panelists, and we will be very happy to take those questions. To do so, you can use a QR code that you can just flash on your screen. It's going to pop up a window in which you can send the questions for our chat moderator, and I'll receive your question and try as much as I can to share your asks with our guests all day long. Our next step then is the first session of this 2022 Global Forest Summit in Brussels and online. The next session is entitled From New York, referring to the New York Declaration on Forests, of course, to Glasgow with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest. That was a key cornerstone delivery of last year COP26, keeping forest on top of the agenda until 2023, 2030. I'm sorry for this. That's going to be the title of our next session. We meet at 10 a.m. CET. Again, very welcome to the 2022 Global Forest Summit. See you later.